Section 28 of Crime, Its Causes and Remedies by Cesare Lombroso. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Leon Harvey. Part 3. Synthesis and Application. Chapter 1. Atavism and Epilepsy in Crime and in Punishment. Subchapter 199. All that I have set forth in the present book, and in those which preceded it, Volume 1 and 2 of the Homme Criminel, proves clearly the insecurity of the ancient criminological scaffolding. Have I succeeded in substituting a more solid edifice? If pride in a long and painful task had not blinded me, I think that I can answer in the affirmative. The fundamental position undoubtedly is that we ought to study not so much the abstract crime as the criminal. Subchapter 200. Atavism. The born criminal shows, in a proportion reaching 33%, numerous specific characteristics that are almost always atavistic. Those who have followed us thus far have seen that many of the characteristics presented by savage races are very often found among born criminals. Such, for example, are the slight development of the pillar system, low cranial capacity, retreating forehead, highly developed frontal sinuses, great frequency of Warnerian bones, early closing of the cranial sutures, the simplicity of the sutures, the thickness of the bones of the skull, enormous development of the maxillaries and the zygomata, prognathism, obliquity of the orbits, greater pigmentation of the skin, tufted and crispy hair, the large ears. To these we may add the luminine appendix, anomalies of the ear, dental diastematta, great agility, relative insensibility to pain, dullness of the sense of touch, great visual acuteness, ability to recover quickly from wounds, blunted affections, precocity as to sensual pleasures, greater resemblance between the sexes, greater incorrigibility of the woman, Spencer, laziness, absence of remorse, impulsiveness, physiopsychic excitability, and especially improvidence, which sometimes appears as courage and again as reckless changing to cowardice. Besides these, there is great vanity, a passion for gambling and alcoholic drinks, violent but fleeting passions, superstition, extraordinary sensitiveness with regard to one's own personality, and a special conception of God and morality. Unexpected analogies are met even with small details. For example, the improvised rules of criminal gangs, the entirely personal influence of the chiefs, the custom of tattooing, the not uncommon cruelty of their games, the excessive use of gestures, the onomatopoetic language with personification of inanimate things, and a special literature recalling that of heroic times, when crimes were celebrated and thought tended to clothe itself in rhythmic form. This atavism explains the diffusion of certain crimes, such as the pedestry and infanticide, whose extension to whole companies we could not explain if we did not recall the Romans, the Greeks, the Chinese, and the Tahitians, who not only did not regard them as crimes, but sometimes even practiced them as a national custom. Garofalo has admirably summed up the psychical characteristics of the born criminal as being the absence of the feeling of shame, honour, and pity, which are those that are lacking in the savage also. We will also add to these the lack of industry and self-control. To those who, like Regulus and Kropotkin, object that there are savage peoples who are honourable and chaste, we must reply that a certain degree of density of population and of association among men is necessary for crimes to develop. It is not possible, for example, to steal when property does not exist, or to swindle when there is no trade. But the proof that these tendencies exist in germ in the savage is that when they begin to pass from their stage of savagery and take on a little civilization, they always develop the characteristics of criminality in an exaggerated form. As Ferrero has pointed out to us, even when honour, chastity, and pity are found among savages, impulsiveness and laziness are never wanting. Savages have a horror of continuous work, so that for them the passage to active and methodical labour lies by the road of selection or of slavery only. Thus, according to the testimony of Tacitus, the impulsiveness of the ancient Germans frequently resulted in the murder of slaves, committed in a fit of anger, an act which was not regarded as culpable. Tacitus notes also their lack of capacity for work. They have, he says, large bodies effective for sudden effort, but they lack the capacity necessary for regular work. When they are not at war, they do nothing. They sleep and eat. The strongest and most warlike live in idleness, leaving the care of the house and the field to the women, the old men and the weak becoming themselves brutalized in sloth. At times, on the other hand, impulsiveness, rather than sluggishness, seems to ally itself with a ceaseless need of movement, which asserts itself in savage peoples in a life of incessant vagabondage. Thus the Andaman Islanders, as Havelock tells us, have so restless a disposition that they remain not more than 2 or 3 days in the same place, and their wanderings have no other reason than the need of movement. This attitude seems to be the result of a passage between physiopsychic inertia and the intermittent need of violent and unrestrained physical and moral excitation, which always goes with inertia and impulsiveness. Thus it is that those people who are normally most lazy and indolent have the most unrestrained and noisy dances, which they carry on until they get into a kind of delirium and fall down utterly exhausted. When the Spaniards, writes Robertson, first saw the American Indians, they were astonished at their mad passion for dancing and at the dizzy activity which this people, almost always cold and passive, displayed when they gave themselves up to this amusement. The Negroes of Africa, writes Du Chaillu, dance madly when they hear the sound of the tom-tom and lose all command of themselves. It is, says Le Tournelle, a real dancing madness which makes them forget their troubles, public or private. We may add that the atavism of the criminal, when he lacks absolutely every trace of shame and pity, may go back far beyond the savage, even to the brutes themselves. Pathological anatomy helps prove our position by showing in the case of the criminal a great development to the cerebellum, a rare union of the calcarean fissure with the parietal occipital, the absence of folds in the passage of Gratiolet, the garter-like shape of the nasal incisure, the frequency of the olecranial foramen, extra ribs and vertebrae, and especially the histological anomalies discovered by Roncoroni in the cortex of the cerebellum of criminals. That is to say, the frequent absence of granular layers and the presence of nerve cells in the white matter, and immense pyramidal cells. In seeking for analogies beyond our own race, we come upon the explanation of the union of the atlas with the occipital bone, the prominence of the canine teeth, the flattening of the palate, and the median occipital fossa, occurring among criminals as with the lemurs and rodents, as also the prehensile foot, the simplicity of the lines of the palm, motor and sensory left-handedness. We recall that the tendency to cannibalism, even without desire for vengeance, and still more that form of sanguinary ferocity, mingled with lubricity, of which examples are furnished us by Gil, Verzeni, Laguerre, Bertrand, Montrusio, the Marquis of Sade, and others, with whom atavism was accompanied by epilepsy, idiocy, or general paralysis. But we always recall the pairing of animals, preceded by ferocious and sanguinary contests to overcome the reticence of the female or to conquer rivals. These facts prove clearly that the most horrible crimes have their origin in those animal instincts of which childhood gives us a pale reflection. Repressed and civilized man by education, environment, and the fear of punishment, they suddenly break out in the born criminal without apparent cause, or under the influence of certain circumstances, such as sickness, atmospheric influences, sexual excitement, or mob influence. We know that certain morbid conditions, such as injuries to the head, meningitis, and chronic intoxication, or certain physiological conditions like pregnancy and senility, produce derangements in the nutrition of the nerve centers, and in consequence, atavistic retrogressions. We can see, then, how they may facilitate the tendency to crime, and when we take into account the short distance that separates the criminal from the savage, we come to understand why convicts so easily adopt savage customs, including cannibalism, as was observed in Australia and Guinea. When we note further how children, until they are educated, are ignorant of the difference between vice and virtue, and steal, strike, and lie without the least compunction, we easily understand the reciprocity in crime, and see why it is that the majority of abandoned children and orphans end by becoming criminals. Further, atavism shows us the inefficacy of punishment for born criminals and why it is that they inevitably have periodic relapses into crime, so the greatest variation shown by the number of crimes against persons is not more than 1 in 25, and by those against property not more than 1 in 30. We see, as Maury very truly remarks, that we are governed by silent laws which never fall into desuetude, and rule society much more surely than the laws inscribed in the codes. Subchapter 201. Epilepsy. The same phenomena which we observe in the case of born criminals appear again in the rare cases of moral insanity, but may be studied minutely and on a large scale in epileptics, criminal or not, as the table given below will prove. That we shall see that not one of the atavistic phenomena shown by criminals is lacking in epilepsy, though epileptics show also certain purely morbid phenomena such as cephalia, atherema, delirium, and hallucination. In born criminals also we find, besides the atavistic characteristics, certain others that appear to be entirely pathological, or which at first sight seem more nearly allied to disease than to atavism. Such are, for example, in the anatomical field, excessive asymmetry, cranial capacity, and face too large or too small, sclerosis, traces of meningitis, and hydrocephalus forehead, oxycephaly, acrocephaly, cranial depressions, numerous osteophytes, early closing of the cranial sutures, thoracic asymmetry, late greyness of hair, late baldness, and abnormal and early wrinkles. In the biological field, alterations of the reflexes and pupillary inequalities. To these we may add peripheral scotomata of the visual field, which one never finds in savages, with whom, on the contrary, the field of vision is remarkably wide and regular, as we see in the case of the Dinkas. There is also to be added the alteration of hearing, taste, and smell, the predilection for animals, precocity in sexual pleasures, amnesia, vertical, amnesiac, and paranoid complications. These abnormalities, which are found in greater proportion among idiots, cretins, and degenerates in general, are to be explained by the fact that in these cases alcoholic intoxication is added to the effect of atavism, and still more to that of epilepsy. However, the participation of epilepsy in producing the effect does not exclude atavism, since they equally involve characteristics at once atavistic and pathological like macrocephaly, cranial sclerosis, wormian bones, rarity of beard, and in the biological field, left-handedness, analgesis, obtuseness of all senses except that of sight, impulsiveness, pederasty, obscenity, sluggishness, superstition, frequent cannibalism, choleric and impetuous disposition, tendency to reproduce the cries and actions of animals, and especially the histological anomalies of the cortex, which we have noted among criminals, and which reproduce the condition of the lower animals, and finally anomalies of the teeth. These latter might appear to have no connection with the brain, but are, on the contrary, intimately connected with it, since the teeth proceed from the same embryonic membrane as the brain does. We may recall here that Gowers, having often noted in epileptic acts peculiar to animals, such as biting, barking, and mewing, concludes from this that there are manifestations of that instinctive animalism which we possess in the latent state. A table is displayed on the page, displaying symptoms ranged from body, brain, face, and cranium, and compared with criminals, epileptics, atavism, phenomena of arrested development, morbid phenomena, atypical phenomena. If fully developed epileptic fits are often lacking in the case of the born criminal, this is because they remain latent, and only show themselves later under the influence of the causes assigned, anger, alcoholism, which bring them to the surface. With both criminals and epileptics there is, to be noted, an insufficient development of the higher centers. This manifests itself in a deterioration in the moral and emotional sensibilities, in sluggishness, physiopsychic hyperexcitability, and especially in a lack of balance in the mental faculties, which even when distinguished by genius and altruism, nevertheless always show gaps, contrasts, and intermittent action. A table is displayed on the page, listing causes, psychic anomalies, sensorial anomalies, motor anomalies, and skin, compared to criminals, epileptics, atavism, phenomena of arrested development, morbid phenomena, and atypical phenomena. Subchapter 202, Combination of morbid anomalies with atavism. Very often, moreover, certain common characteristics of criminals and epileptics have been classed as abnormal or morbid and not as atavistic, entirely because of the insufficiency of our embryological and physiogenetic knowledge. Many of the characteristics given in the preceding table, which however is only schematic, are atavistic and morbid at the same time, such as microcephaly, cranial sclerosis, etc. Facial asymmetry would also appear to be atavistic when we recall, for example, the flat fissures, penta, so likewise the abnormally wrinkled face, taking us back to the Hottentots and the apes. Hernia also, as Ferre rightly remarks, recalls conditions that are normal in the lower vertebrates and in the embryo. Very often morbidity and atavism go back to a common cause, as Wagner observes in a magnificent dissertation. The idea, he writes, that the atavism of criminals is associated with some specific disease of the fetus has been completely confirmed by the discoveries of Ettinghausen. If, for example, we freeze the roots of an oak so as to partially kill it, the following year it will put out leaves that are not like that of the leaves of the modern oak, but like those of the oak of the Tertiary period. This fact explains the reappearance of intermediate and indistinct fossil forms. We see very clearly, then, that influences capable of producing a disease can bring about atavistic morphological retrogressions. The epileptic background upon which the clinical and anatomical picture of the moral lunatic and the born criminal is drawn, a picture that would otherwise be lost in a vague, semi-juridical, semi-psychiatric hypothesis, explains the instantaneousness, periodicity, and paradoxical character of their symptoms, which are doubtless the most marked characteristics. Note, for example, in this class, the coexistence and interchange of kindness and ferocity, of cowardice and the maddest recklessness, and of genius and complete stupidity. Subchapter 203. The Criminaloid. Criminaloids, while quite separable from born criminals, do not lack some connection with epilepsy and atavism. Thus there are more epileptics among them, 10% among pickpockets, than among normal men, and a great proportion of criminal types, 17%, but there are also certain specific anomalies, such as left-handedness, common among swindlers. In the biology of the criminaloid, we observe a smaller number of anomalies in touch, sensibility to pain, psychometry, and especially less earthly baldness and greyness, and less tattooing. But on the other hand, we meet with a larger number of strictly morbid anomalies, depending upon the abuse of alcoholic drinks, such as atheromata, paresis, and scars. Psychoanomalies are especially less frequent with the criminaloid, who has not the cynicism of the born criminal nor the passion for doing evil for his own sake. He confesses his fault more easily and with more sincerity, and repents more often. But he is more lascivious, and more often given to alcoholism, and the criminaloid women are more susceptible to suggestion. The criminaloid is more precocious and relapses oftener, at least that is the case with pickpockets and simple thieves. They are often drawn to crime by a greater opportunity, although the lack of self-control which makes the epileptic commit crime within reason is sometimes found in the criminaloid also. We may recall how Casanova confessed that when he committed a fraud, he never premeditated it, but seemed to yield to his superior will. A pickpocket said to me, "When the inspiration comes to us, we cannot resist." Dostoevsky depicts smugglers of the prison as carrying on their occupation almost without returns, notwithstanding the grave risks they run, and in spite of repeated promises not to relapse. Mendel and Benedict describe the impulsive nature of the vagabond, which keeps him moving without object and without rest. Criminaloids, then, differ from born criminals in degree, not in kind. This is so true that the greater number of them, having become habitual criminals, thanks to a long sojourn in prison, can no longer be distinguished from born criminals except by the slighter character of their physical marks of criminality. Still less different from born criminals are those latent criminals, high in power, whom society venerates as its chiefs. They bear the marks of congenital criminality, but the high position generally prevents their criminal character from being recognized. Their families, of which they are the scourges, may discover it, or their depraved nature may be revealed all too late at the expense of the whole country, at the head of which their own shamelessness, seconded by the ignorance and cowardice of the majority, has caused them to be placed. Even this strange species of criminal monomaniac, who seems to differ from the epileptic in the motive of his crime and the manner of carrying it out, shows nevertheless the epileptic and atavistic origin of his criminality by obsessions, interrupted periods of ideation, lack of self-control, exaggerated importance given to certain details, exhaustion after his criminal crisis, fondness for symbolism, excessive intermittent activity, and fined by hereditary stigmata. Subchapter 204. Criminal insane. Even among the true insane criminals, those forms predominate which we may call the hypertrophy of crime. The exaggeration of the born criminal, not only in bodily and functional characteristics, but also in the manner of committing the crime and in conduct afterward. These serve to explain to us the extent of the impulsive, obscene, and cruel tendencies of the criminal insane, who are almost always obscure epileptics or born criminals upon whom melancholia and monomania have grafted themselves, according to the natural tendency of different forms of psychic disorders to take root together upon the corrupted soil of degeneracy. We have seen likewise how hysterical persons, alcoholics, dipsomaniacs, pyromaniacs, kleptomaniacs, the temporarily insane, reproduced many of the characteristics of the epileptic. Even the matoid, who on account of his habitual calm and the absence of signs of degeneracy and heredity, seem far removed from epilepsy, yet shows at times this epileptic form which we have seen to be the kernel of crime. Subchapter 205. Criminals by Passion. Criminals of this class form a species apart, and are in complete contrast with the born criminal both in the harmonious lines of the body, the beauty of the soul, and great nervous and emotional sensitiveness, as well as in the motives of their crimes, always noble and powerful, such as love or politics. Nevertheless, they show some points of resemblance with epileptics, such as their tendency to excesses, impulsiveness, suddenness in their outbursts, and frequent amnesia. Subchapter 206. Occasional criminals. Occasional criminals, or better, pseudo-criminals, are those who do not seek the occasion for the crime, but are almost drawn into it, or fall into the meshes of the code for very insignificant reasons. These are the only ones who escape all connection with atavism and epilepsy. But as Gallifatto observes, these ought not, properly speaking, to be called criminals. Subchapter 207. Causes. The study of the causes of crime does not lessen the fatal influence to be assigned to the organic factor, which certainly amounts to 35% and possibly even 40%, the so-called causes of crime being often only the last determinants in the great strength of congenital impulsiveness, the principal cause. This we have proved in some cases by the continual relapses occasioned by very small causes, or even without causes, when not only the economic environment has been changed, when all the circumstances that might encourage crime have been removed, and we have proved it especially by the increasing recidivism in London, notwithstanding the great efforts made by Great Britain to suppress the causes which produce crime. Finally, we have seen that great circumstances have so strong an action upon criminaloids that they are equivalent to organic causes, and we may even say that they become organic. Among these circumstances should be noted the effect of excessive heat upon rapes, assaults, assassinations, and revolts, and the effect of alcohol and heredity upon the whole gamut of crime. And to these must be added the effect of race, which in Italy through the Semitic race, and in Florence through the Ligurian race, increases the crimes of blood. A fact of the greatest importance is that the same causes which diminish certain crimes increase others, making it difficult for the statesman to devise a remedy. Thus we have seen that education and wealth cause a decrease in certain brutal crimes, especially homicides and assassinations, but at the same time increase others or even create new crimes, such as bankruptcy and swindling. And if, for example, too great a density is the cause of many crimes, such as frauds and thefts, a sparse population in its turn favours brigandage and crimes of blood. Scarcity favours thefts from the forests, forgeries, insurrections, and incendiary fires, while cheapness of grain multiplies the rapes, homicides, and crimes against persons generally. Alcohol, which next to heat is the most powerful crime producer, increases, when it is cheap, all the crimes against persons and against the public administration, and if it is dear, all the crimes against property. Yet it presents this strange contradiction, while the more serious crimes are least numerous where alcohol is the most abused, doubtless because this abuse takes place in just those localities where there is a high degree of civilization, and this, by favouring inhibition, decreases the more barbarous crimes. The school likewise is a cause of crime, but where education is the most general, it diminishes the numbers and seriousness of the crimes. Subchapter 208. Necessity of crime. Statistics as well as anthropological investigations show us crime, then as a natural phenomenon, a phenomenon, some philosophers would say, as necessary as birth, death, or consumption. This idea of the necessity of crime, however bold it may appear, is nevertheless not so new, nor so heterodox as one might believe at first sight. Centuries ago, Casaubon expressed the same truth when he said, "Man does not sin, but he is coerced in various degrees." And St. Bernard likewise said, "Which one of us, however experienced he may be, can distinguish among his own wishes the influence of the morsus serpentis from that of the morbus mentis?" And further, the sin is less in our heart, and we do not know whether we ought to ascribe it to ourselves or to the enemy. It is hard to know what the heart does and what it is obliged to do. St. Augustine is still more explicit when he says, "Not even the angels can make the man who wills evil will the good." The boldest, most ardent defender of this theory is a fervent Catholic and a priest of the title Roof. The defenders of theories quite opposed to our own also affirm it indirectly by the contradictions into which they fall in their definitions. If we compare the different attempts at criminal codes, we see how difficult it is for the legal expert to fix the theory of irresponsibility and to find an exact definition for it. The whole world knows what a good or bad action is, but it is difficult, even impossible, to tell whether the depraved act has been committed with a full or only an incomplete knowledge of the evil, says Mittermeier. Way writes, "We have not yet any scientific knowledge of responsibility," and Marek says, "Irresponsibility is a matter which criminal justice cannot decide with certainty in any special case." In fact, there are men who are afflicted with insipid insanity, and are so profoundly predisposed to it that the slightest cause may make them fall into it. Others are driven by heredity to eccentricity or to immoral excesses. Knowledge of the act, says Delbruck, with an examination of the body and the mind before and after it, is not enough to clear up the question of responsibility. It is necessary to know the life of the criminal from the cradle to the dissecting table. Now, as long as the criminal is living, it is hardly possible to dissect him. Carrara presumes absolute responsibility where both intellect and will combine in the accomplishment of a criminal action. But he adds immediately afterward, upon the condition that the action of the will has not been lessened by physical, intellectual, or moral causes. Now we have seen that there is no crime in which these causes are lacking. Subchapter 209. The right to punish. Someone replies to us, "But if you deny responsibility, what right have you to punish? You proclaim that a man is not answerable to his conduct, yet you exact a penalty. How inconsistent and how harsh." I shall never forget how a venerable thinker shook his head when he read these pages, and said to me, "Where will you arrive with such premises? Must we let ourselves be pillaged and murdered by brigands upon the pretext that we cannot decide whether they know they are doing wrong?" I answer, nothing is less logical than to try to be logical. Nothing is more imprudent than to try to maintain theories, even those which are apparently the soundest, if they are going to upset the order of society. If a physician at the bedside of a patient, when there is grave danger, must proceed cautiously even with the best established system of medicine, the sociologist must observe still great circumspection, for if he puts into operation innovations of an upsetting nature, he will simply succeed in demonstrating the uselessness and inefficiency of his science. Scientific knowledge, however, is happily not at war but in alliance with social order and practice. If crime is a necessary thing, so also is society's resistance to crime and consequently the punishment of crime, which must be measured by the amount of apprehension with which it inspires the individual. Punishment thus becomes less hateful, but also less contradictory and certainly more efficacious. I do not believe that any theory of punishment has a sound basis, except that of natural necessity and the right of self-defense. This is the old theory of Beccaria and of Romagnosi, of Carmignani and in part of Rosmini, Mancini, and Elero, and it is now valiant defenders in Ferri, Garofalo, and above all, Politi. In Germany we see this theory put forward by Hommel, Feuerbach, Grollmann, and Hotzendorf. In England by Hobbes and Bentham, and in France by Ortelan and Tissot. Tissot declares that it is impossible to find any moral relationship between crime and punishment. In France, the state prosecuting attorney has said, "Man has no intrinsic right to punish. In order to have this right, he must have the knowledge of absolute justice. If it were not in the name of the most absolute necessity, how could a man arrogate to himself the right of judging his fellow man? From the fact that man cannot defend himself without inflicting punishment, the conclusion has been drawn that he has the right to punish. But that he really does not have it may be seen from the fact that when his pretended right is taken by itself without reference to the concrete need, it ceases to be valid. Rondeau, governor under Joseph II, in his Essai physique sur la peine de mort, denied the freedom of the will, repudiated the universally accepted notion of good and evil, merit and demerit, and speaking of repressive justice, he declared, "Crime does not exist in nature. It is a law alone that imposes this unjust designation upon acts that are necessary and inevitable. The innumerable and diverse causes which produce the pretended criminality are all material and all independent of our will. Like the miasma that produces fever, anger is a passing fever, jealousy a momentary delirium, the rapacity of the thief, the swindler an aberration disease, and the depraved passions that drive men to sins against nature are organic imperfections. All moral evil is a result of physical evil. The murderer himself is a sick man like all other criminals. Why, and in the name of what principle, could they be punished, unless it is because they disturb the regular course of the social life and impede the normal and legitimate development of the species? On this ground, society, or better, the government, had the right to place an obstacle in the way of the fatal consequences of their acts, just as a landowner has a right to build a dike against a flood which threatens to inundate his fields. The social power can, then, without scruple and without hesitation, deprive malefactors of their liberty. But the moment that all crime is recognized as the moral product and logical consequence of some disease, punishment must become only a medical treatment. We shall cure the thief and the vagrant by teaching them the joys of honest work, if by an exception, which is unhappily too frequent, they show themselves insensible to medical cure, they must be separated from their fellow citizens. We see here that our boldest conclusions are already more than a century old. One might question whether it is from wickedness or from the effect of their own organism that wild beasts devour man, but notwithstanding this doubt, no one would abstain from killing them, and tamely allow himself to be devoured by them. Nor would anyone, because of a belief in the right of domestic animals to life and liberty, refrain from harnessing them up for work or slaughtering them for food. And what have we to confine the insane if it is not for self-defense? By what other right do we deprive the conscript soldier of his most holy and noble right of forming his own home and family, and send him, many times in spite of himself, to death? It is just because the principle of punishment is based upon the necessity of defense that it is really not open to objection. Formerly, punishment, which is made to correspond to the crime, and like it had an atavistic origin, did not attempt to conceal the fact that it was either an equivalent or an act of vengeance. The judges were not ashamed to carry out the sentence themselves, as the members of the Holy Vermin did. Crime was considered not only as an evil, but as the worst of evils, which only death could pay for. If the guilty did not confess, torture was used. When torture was dispensed with, witnesses sufficed. Later, more presumptions were sufficient, and such presumptions. Not only did the judges kill the criminal, but they wanted him to taste death slowly. This cruelty did not diminish crime, but it was logical nevertheless. The theory does not contradict the practice. The conception was that the criminal never improves, and that he begets children like himself. The death of the criminal alone prevented recidivism. Men that day obeyed the instinct that impelled them to punish one offence by committing another, but they did not conceal this view. But our logic, our sincerity in penal matters, where is it? We still have this primitive instinct. When we are trying a criminal, we have always a tendency to measure his punishment by the degree of repugnance and horror with which his crime inspires us, and to be filled with indignation against the man who has confessed it. So we not infrequently see representatives of the law forgetting their abstract theories and demanding in loud tones that the vengeance of society be visited upon the offender. Yet the same men, when inditing a book upon criminal law or sitting to legislate on the same subject, would repudiate such an attitude with horror. And what logic is there in the theory which has been brought into vogue again by Roeder, Garelli, Bassina? The punishment is for the purpose of reform. We know how very well that the reform of the guilty is always or nearly always an exception, for the prison not only does not improve him, but even makes him worse. Besides, how, with such a theory, could one justify the punishments inflicted for political crimes or crimes committed through excitement or passion, followed as they almost always are by spontaneous and complete repentance? Oppenheim, after having written that every crime should be followed by a proportionate penalty and that the penalty should not only be an evil but should appear as such, goes on to say, with Moll and Thur, punishment should have for its only aim the reformation and employment of the criminal. But is not this an obvious contradiction? How can you reconcile the theory which has a criminal dishonoured with that which pretends to improve him? How can you brand him upon the brow with iron and say to him, make yourself better? What are the theories of Herbert, Kant, Tomid, and Hegel, but the ancient idea of vengeance and the lex talionis disguised in modern dress? And with all this, the state does not think of the morrow. It shuts the prisoner up, and when he has served the term of his sentence, it sets him at liberty again, thus increasing the danger of society, for the criminal always becomes more depraved in the promiscuity of the prison, and goes out more irritated and better armed against society. With this theory, it is not possible to justify the increase of the penalty in the case of recidivism, nor the adoption of preventive measures. Some legislators maintain that a criminal ought to be made to expiate his crime, but the conception of expiation is ecclesiastical, and how can we say that a criminal expiates his crime when it is by force that we take away his life or his liberty? The theory of intimidation in its turn offers numerous contradictions. Our predecessors cut off noses and ears, quartered, boiled in water and in oil, and poured melted lead down the throat, but they succeeded only in multiplying crimes and making them more horrible. For the frequency and ferocity of the punishments hardened men. In the time of Robespierre, even the children played at guillotine. But what do men expect to accomplish by intimidation nowadays, when penalties are being made so much milder and the prisons are almost like comfortable hotels? And then what sort of justice is that which punishes a man less for the crime he has committed than to serve as an example to others? Further, the right to punish, based upon the nature of the deed itself, has nothing absolute in it, since we see the penalty varying according to the temper and habits of the particular judge. Breton affirms that a judge accustomed to deal with great crimes will inflict punishments relatively more severe when he comes to deal with minor offences. He will give months in prison instead of days. No judges, moreover, even in the same country, and when it is a question of identically the same crime, agree exactly upon the sentence. Is it possible to believe in an external absolute principle of justice among men when you see this pretended justice vary so greatly within a brief interval of space or time, when we see bigamy and rape punished so differently in England and in Germany, when we see that not so many years ago a Jew who accosted a Catholic prostitute was condemned to death, as was likewise a Catholic who allowed an involuntary blasphemy to escape him, while infanticide, incest, and rape were tolerated? Do we not even today see the right to pardon and the theory of limitation still in force, as if the favour of the king or the lapse of time could change the depraved nature of the criminal or make him less likely to relapse into crime? End of section 28.